Network is absolutely free. Just search.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back into the GSMC Dead Ball Sports Podcast. And for our third segment of today's show, we're going to be talking about certain players who could get franchise tagged here. Now, as Anthony was talking about, I don't necessarily know the difference between a transition tag and your standard franchise tag. For those of you who don't necessarily know what the franchise tag does, it's basically an insurance plan for a player who you don't want to see leave in the offseason. So you tag him for 1 year, and it can only be done once in an offseason for one player. So that makes it very difficult sometimes to decide who you want to tie down if a lot of players who are in contract years have either performed well for you or even exceeded your wildest expectations. So, as you'll see with a lot of these guys, it could come down to how they view themselves on the market and how the teams value them and the other players who could be up for the tag. So, without further ado, let's try and dissect the top players who could be popular candidates for the franchise tag. Starting off with an interesting one here in Baltimore. How about Ronnie Stanley? Ronnie Stanley is someone who will be highly coveted as an offensive tackle on the market because of how the OT market has expanded, how expensive some of these top line guys are going for in free agency. Over $25 million, potentially. I think that Ronnie Stanley could be very popular as a franchise tag candidate for the Baltimore Ravens because of the fact that when you look at their roster, there are certainly several players over the next coming years you may want to prioritize in terms of extension. And Ronnie Stanley, while he still is a high-profile tackle, is an aging guy. So you're not necessarily going to invest in him in the long-term future. And there are certainly puzzle pieces on your defense like Marlon Humphrey, Kyle Hamilton, and other such players who you're going to want to invest in as well. Maybe a guy like Nate Wiggins in the next couple of years too. So if I'm Ronnie Stanley and I'm the Baltimore Ravens, I have to look at it this way. Because of the competitive nature of the O-line market, because of the fact that there wouldn't be too many options for the Ravens in free agency and potentially in the draft at where they're picking to fulfill Ronnie Stanley's or fill Ronnie Stanley's shoes should he leave, I believe that it will make a lot of sense to keep him for this 1 year and potentially tackle the issue after he sees out the franchise tag next year. Because at that point, it will make a lot of sense for Ronnie Stanley to potentially move on and retire or go to another team. So, if I'm the Ravens, I'm viewing this as more of a short-term deal rather than prolonging his contract. Just because, A, I wouldn't want to pay too much for a guy like Ronnie Stanley who is on the older side of things in terms of O-linemen on the market. And then starting to invest in the future of my team and some young guys who are going to be up for contracts as well. That's where I stand with Ronnie Stanley. I think it will make a lot of sense just so that you can prolong potentially his career, have another good year for him protecting Lamar's blind side, then start to think about how you move on from him as well. Then the other player is going to be very interesting because it will be his second career franchise tag, T. Higgins. T. Higgins is someone who will command a lot of money on the market, but in my opinion still is that number 2 receiver. I don't think he's going to get, say, a top-end deal like a Justin Jefferson. I think that if you're a team looking to invest in a receiver this offseason, you're looking at T. Higgins, you would not want to go over, say, the $50 million threshold for him. He's someone who I think will sit around the $35 to $45 million threshold, no more, no less. Because I love him as a receiver, and I love him as a Cincinnati Bengal. But a lot of these teams view him as a hot commodity and may want to bolster their roster, and he would be a good fit for a lot of these teams. But when I think about how the Cincinnati Bengals will project without him offensively, he does add a lot of value. And he offers a perfect balance to this wide receiver room that would be really amiss should he depart. So that's why I'm starting to think that the Bengals will try and franchise tag him again. Just because you want to tie him down and ensure the future of this Bengals or offense at the very least remains intact. And also, it would get the monkey off their back because it's the one big thing out of many big things the Bengals have to worry about this offseason. If you franchise tag T. Higgins, that's the least of your worries. Then you can start to think about Jamar Chase's extension, Hendrickson's extension, how you improve the defense, whether or not you have enough cap space to make certain moves in free agency to acquire edge rushing talent. That would alleviate so much pressure if T. Higgins gets franchise tagged as soon as possible. Just so that it opens up so much more opportunities for the Bengals to invest in more pressing areas of need. That's just my opinion. I truly think he could also be a trade candidate as well, and I think that a lot of teams will leap to acquire his services. But I do believe that the Cincinnati Bengals love and respect him as a player. The fan base loves him, and he truly is a huge part of this Bengals offense that would be missing if he were to leave. So don't necessarily get it out of your mind that he is an immediate trade candidate, because there is a lot of value to keeping him if you're Cincinnati. But for how long will start to become the question next offseason, because like I said, franchise tags can only happen once in a while. So you don't necessarily want to keep franchise tagging him. At some point, you got to sit down with him and have a concrete conversation about the extension. But for now, you just want to try and keep him for as long as possible. Maybe if it's just for this year. And that's all I have to say about T. Higgins. Then let's go over to another interesting under-the-radar one, just because he would be the most, in my opinion, intriguing option on the free agency market and would command a lot of money as well. And I think that the Vikings will be wise to franchise tag him at least for 1 year so that they actually can understand what difference he can make for this team, and that is Sam Darnold. Sam Darnold has obviously been someone who's talked about a lot in terms of trade rumors, in terms of whether or not teams would sign him in the offseason. But the reason I believe that the Vikings should franchise tag him is that you're not totally investing in him, first and foremost. It would only be a 1-year deal, and you would still have the best years of J. McCarthy's career, perhaps, to look forward to. And I know Vikings fans, some of them are chomping at the bit to get McCarthy out there to see what he's all about because they invested their top 10 draft pick in him. But if Sam Darnold is someone who the Vikings believe can continue to perform at a high enough level to where they can, in the background, get J.J. McCarthy up to speed, then why not do it? Because I don't necessarily think that throwing J.J. McCarthy out there right now would be the best of options just because of where you're at this season. You were a 14-win team that very well could have been the number 1 seed in the NFC. So do you really want to lose a big part of that in Sam Darnold? Or do you want to run it back at least 1 more year and give J.J. McCarthy a full chance to learn behind him. And I think that would be a very wise option. Not a lot of Vikings fans would agree with me, and maybe not a lot of pundits either, but it makes a lot of sense. But the only caveat is there are a lot of candidates for the franchise tagging the Vikings. A lot of people with expiring contracts, especially in that very talented secondary. One of them being Byron Murphy Jr. So, do the Vikings want to invest in retaining the core of this defense, which is really excellent, or retaining a guy who they might believe is expendable after next year? And that truly is the question I'm intrigued by. Because if the Vikings truly believe that they can build through their defense and truly believe that their defense is going to be what continues to keep them in the contention window in the NFC, then I'm all for it. But you don't necessarily want to lose someone who was a big reason as to why your offense was so successful and could give your young quarterback of the future a little bit more time to acclimate himself. So it can't be out of the question. Then last but not least, let's talk about Chris Godwin. I feel like this is an interesting situation because technically he could re-sign with the Bucs as a free agent, but thinking about how that receiving core played without him, without White Evans for that matter, with guys like Cade Otton, Jalen McMillan, Sterling Shepard stepping up and being a huge reason as to why they still made the playoffs, you might want to cut ties overall with a guy like Chris Godwin. I don't necessarily think that the future of this team lies in a 30-something-year-old wide receiver, no matter how talented he has been. And I truly think that his value is slowly and rapidly declining as someone who could be highly coveted on the free agent market. And that injury, most importantly, is very detrimental to the rest of his career. So if I'm the Bucs, I would want to offload him as soon as possible, whether it just be cutting him or finding a place for him, because I don't see much value anymore, unfortunately, for Chris Godwin on this team. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Coming up next, we transition to the world of college basketball, playing a little bit of game of buy or sell. We'll be right back to talk about it after this short break.